Hi everyone, this is Instructor Hernandez, and I am using this video lecture to review your diagnostic essays. I want to point out that this video lecture will cover the diagnostic essays in general. I won't be discussing specific feedback for individual students. However, you should have received feedback from me for your specific diagnostic essay on Canvas. And based on the comments that I gave you, I'd like you to use this video lecture to learn more about the specific areas that I may have identified for you to work in. So off the top, I saw a lot of strengths with these essays for the class as a whole. Many of you had very strong opinions on this topic, which was great to see because that meant that you had a lot to say. And I know that this couldn't have been an easy topic to write about. Some of you may be tired of discussing COVID or the pandemic. So I just have to commend you all on that for taking the time to go in depth and share your experience as it relates to learning loss. That being said, there was very relevant personal experience for this essay, and that is something that I encourage you all to use in your essays. And some of you very successfully used your personal experience to support your thesis statement and your ideas. There were also unique perspectives on the topic. No one addressed the essay prompt in the same way. And some of you had very different takes on learning loss and the pandemic. In terms of areas to improve, these are the 4 common areas that I identified for the class as a whole. And these are also very common areas that I often see at the beginning of the semester. And I will use this video lecture to go through each one in more detail. So just to very quickly review, the topic of the diagnostic essay was learning loss and the pandemic. And you read an article that discussed a debate, which is if learning loss should be measured. And I also asked you to consider what learning loss is and how you would define learning loss. And we see in the article that it's defined as gaps of knowledge, particularly in fundamental skills such as reading and math. The article also mentioned that several studies have been done to measure learning loss in students. And almost all of the studies agree that most students experience some type of learning loss and that some groups were impacted more than others. In terms of how learning loss is measured, the article cited standardized tests as being the primary way to measure learning loss, which, as we know from reading the article, that can be very controversial. The reason that standardized tests are controversial is because some people feel they may stigmatize or discourage certain groups, particularly those groups that were impacted more than others. And according to the article, these groups included students of color as well as students living in low-income areas. Additionally, standardized tests do not account for what students actually did learn, including the life lessons that they would have not learned inside the classroom. Finally, another issue with the standardized tests is that they are inaccurate because less students were able to take the standardized tests in person than actually were in school at the time. Now, one of the issues I identified in the essays was responding to the topic, and that's what I'd like to discuss first. The writing prompt for the diagnostic essay is as follows. There are 2 questions. Actually, there's 1 question and 2 follow-up questions. Do you think that you personally have experienced learning loss this past year? If so, what do you think you would have learned if not for the pandemic? And if not, why? So a good way to approach a writing prompt, especially if it's written in the form of a question, is to answer that question in a complete sentence. And your answer can serve as the basis for your thesis statement, which becomes the focus of your entire essay. So just to review, a thesis statement is your position on the topic. And for a timed essay, particularly one that is asking you to consider your own experience, you could have addressed the question in the writing prompt and use that as your thesis. For example, if you felt that you did experience learning loss, then your thesis statement could be something as simple as, yes, I do feel I experienced learning loss this past year, or no, I do not feel I experienced learning loss. You then want to consider points of support for your thesis. For instance, if you feel you experience learning loss, then you could elaborate on how you saw that happen. If not for the pandemic, I would have learned, and then you could list perhaps 2 or 3 things that you think you may have learned. Or you could outline the specific ways that you felt you experienced learning loss. And you can start each of these by saying, for example. You could also point out things that you still learned how to do. So if you feel like learning loss did not impact you in a negative way, this is a way that you could start one of your points of support. Even though I was learning remotely, I still learned how to, and you would elaborate on that as well. Or one thing the pandemic taught me was, so the points of support that you see here, each of those can frame its own paragraph. And then your paragraphs support your thesis statement, which helps you elaborate on your position. Now, keep in mind, each individual point of support should make up one paragraph and be the only focus of that paragraph. And you want to include a topic sentence that demonstrates to the reader what that paragraph will be about, as well as at least one concrete example that supports your idea. Some of you had very clear topic sentences, but you didn't include specific examples that supported those topic sentences, or you didn't elaborate fully on what you mentioned in that topic sentence. So here's an example. Let's say that your thesis is you did experience learning loss. And one of your points of support is you experienced learning loss because you found it very hard to concentrate on learning remotely, and you were just doing everything you could to stay awake. And here's an example that elaborates on that. So let's say you missed an entire math lesson because you were unable to concentrate on what your teacher was saying online. And instead, you focused more on staying awake and not dozing off. And you saw that when you took your first math quiz, how much you actually did not remember or retain from your teacher's lesson. Here's another example. So we have our point of support, which could be a topic sentence for one paragraph. One way I experienced learning loss was I did not improve basic study skills such as note-taking. So that right there is a concrete example of how one person experienced learning loss. And here's the elaboration. Here's the development of that idea. When I went to school in person, I always took notes during class. When I was learning online, I almost never took notes while my teacher was teaching. It was too easy to get distracted and not pay attention. I would go online or text my friends instead of listening. By the time I took my first online test, I had no notes to study off of, and I did much worse than I would have in person. So if you compare the example to the topic sentence that's above it, you can see how the example helps explain that idea that is mentioned in the topic sentence, and it gives the reader a much clearer picture of what you actually experienced. In addition to paragraph structure and development of ideas, I did see frequent grammatical errors in many of the essays. And the most common issues that I identified related to grammar were sentence structure, specifically run-on sentences and sentence fragments. There were also errors related to punctuation, and the most common errors, which are very common across the board for all students, were comma placement and semicolon placement. So we're going to review these elements of grammar in class. And if you're curious to learn more about these now, you can also check out the section on grammar in the Little Seagull Handbook. So just as a reminder, the yellow section is focused on grammar. And you can look through that section and specifically look at the sections on sentence structure and punctuation. In terms of how you can use your diagnostic essay to help you with your writing in this class, like I mentioned, you want to look at the comments I left on your essay specifically and focus on the areas that I identified for you. And if you need clarity on any of those areas or you're not quite sure what my comments meant, then feel free to email me or visit me during office hours. When we write our first essay in class, you also want to keep in mind the general essay and paragraph structure that I discussed here. And you also want to make sure that you're responding directly to the writing prompt. So going back to the beginning of this presentation, I showed you the writing prompt itself was a specific question. So when we have our first essay due in this class, we're going to discuss the writing prompt and how you can respond directly to that. I'd like for everyone now to review the diagnostic essay that you wrote on Canvas as well as my comments. And if for some reason you can't see my comments, then please contact me right away and I can just email those to you. If you have any other questions related to the diagnostic essay or anything else in class, then please feel free to send me a message or drop by during my office hours.